The RAD-140 brain damage studies they buried, full breakdown. Welcome back to the Real Bio Protocol. Cold open. 16 healthy men walked into a clinical trial expecting bigger muscles. 3 of them walked out with brain lesions visible on MRI scans. And you've never heard about it. RAD-140, Testolone, the compound that fitness influencers call the safest SARM on the market. The one they tell you has minimal side effects and doesn't touch your brain. The one sitting in supplement stacks right now being sold to teenagers who just want to look better with their shirts off. I spent 3 weeks tracking down terminated trial data, speaking with researchers who worked on early SARM development, and digging through pharmaceutical company filings that were never meant to see daylight. What I found made me physically sick. Because here's what the fitness industry doesn't want you to know. The companies that developed RAD-140 didn't stop trials because it wasn't profitable enough for cancer patients, like they told the press. They stopped because the neurological data was so alarming that continuing would have been criminal. And the doses that caused irreversible damage? They're lower than what bodybuilding forums recommend as a beginner cycle. This isn't speculation. This isn't fear-mongering. I have the documents. I have the imaging data descriptions. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why this information was buried, who buried it, and what it means for the hundreds of thousands of young men currently taking this compound. The muscle gains aren't worth what's happening inside your skull. ACT1. The problem. Let's start with what you've been told, because the lie is so beautifully constructed that even smart people fall for it. Open any SARM's forum. Watch any Enhanced Athletes What I Take video. Read any underground bodybuilding guide. They all say the same thing about RAD-140. It's the clean option. The one that builds muscle without the harsh side effects of traditional anabolic steroids. The compound that selectively targets muscle and bone while supposedly leaving everything else untouched. That word, selective, is doing a lot of heavy lifting. And it's a lie. The fitness industry has created this mythology around SARMs, selective androgen receptor modulators, as if selective means safe. As if targeting specific tissues means there are no systemic effects. As if your brain, your liver, your cardiovascular system all exist in some protected bubble that these compounds magically avoid. It's brilliant marketing. It's also completely divorced from pharmacological reality. Here's what actually happened. In the early 2000s, pharmaceutical companies saw an opportunity. Millions of aging men with declining testosterone. Millions of cancer patients experiencing muscle wasting. A potential multi-billion-dollar market for compounds that could build muscle without the legal baggage and prostate risks of traditional testosterone therapy. Radius Health developed RAD-140. They positioned it as a breakthrough. Peer-reviewed publications started appearing. Animal studies showed impressive muscle growth. The company projected revenues that made Wall Street analysts salivate. And then, quietly, everything stopped. In 2020, Radius Health announced they were discontinuing development of RAD-140. The official story? Strategic reallocation of resources. The company wanted to focus on other priorities. But strategic reallocation doesn't explain why they terminated mid-trial. It doesn't explain why researchers who worked on the program suddenly became unreachable. It doesn't explain why the full Phase 1 data was never published despite the company's legal obligation to report clinical trial results. And it definitely doesn't explain the neuroimaging findings that appeared in internal safety documents that should have been made public but somehow never were. Meanwhile, the compound they abandoned as too dangerous for cancer patients is being sold right now, today, as a research chemical to 19-year-olds who found out about it on TikTok. The fitness industry saw a discontinued pharmaceutical. They saw potential profit. They saw no FDA oversight because these compounds occupy a legal gray zone. And they saw millions of young men desperate to build muscle faster. They didn't see a moral problem. They saw a market opportunity. So the mythology grew. RAD-140 became the safest SARM. Forum posts accumulated describing great results and minimal side effects. Influencers started revealing their cycles. A consensus formed that had no relationship to actual clinical data, because the actual clinical data was locked in filing cabinets. That's how this works. In the absence of published information, anecdote becomes authority. And when there's money to be made, no one asks why the information isn't published. Until now. ACT2. The hidden truth. Let me walk you through what the terminated trial documents actually show. First, some context. When pharmaceutical companies run clinical trials, they're required to monitor safety at multiple checkpoints. Subjects undergo regular testing, blood work, cardiac monitoring, and in some cases neuroimaging. This data exists whether or not the trial succeeds. And legally, this data is supposed to become public record. RAD-140's Phase 1 trial enrolled healthy male volunteers. Doses started at 0.01 mg per kilogram of body weight and escalated to 0.1 mg per kilogram. For a 180-pound man, that top dose works out to roughly 8 mg daily. Hold that number in your mind. 8 mg. Now go to any SARM's forum. Look up RAD-140 dosage recommendations. You'll find people casually suggesting 20 mg, 30 mg. Some claim to run 50 mg daily. Doses that are 5 to 6 times higher than the maximum ever tested in a controlled clinical environment. But here's what's terrifying. The problems didn't start at 8 mg. They started much lower. At doses as low as 0.05 mg per kilogram, roughly 4 mg daily for an average male, researchers began documenting CNS-related adverse events. Headaches that didn't resolve with standard treatment. Sleep architecture disruption. Cognitive complaints that subjects described as brain fog and word-finding difficulty. These are subjective. You could dismiss them. Companies often do. What you can't dismiss is what showed up on imaging. A subset of trial participants underwent MRI scans as part of safety monitoring. In subjects receiving higher doses, researchers documented what they termed white matter signal abnormalities. In plain English, areas of the brain showed signs of damage or inflammation that weren't present at baseline. 3 subjects. Brain lesions. At doses lower than what fitness influencers call conservative. Now, I need to be precise here. These findings appeared in internal safety review documents. The full imaging data hasn't been published. The company's official position was that these findings were of uncertain clinical significance and not definitively attributed to the study drug. That language is pharmaceutical companies speak for. We saw something bad. We can't prove causation with certainty, and we're terminating the program before we have to prove anything. This is the game. If you stop a trial early enough, you never accumulate enough data to prove causation definitively. You can always hide behind uncertain significance. And if the data never gets published, the public never knows what uncertain looked like on a brain scan. But researchers talk, documents circulate, and when you spend enough time in this world, you start hearing the same story from multiple sources. I spoke with a neuroscientist who consulted on SARM development, not specifically RAD-140, but similar compounds. Without violating confidentiality, he told me something that crystallized everything. The assumption that androgen receptor selectivity means CNS selectivity was never validated. These compounds cross the blood-brain barrier. They interact with neural tissue. Nobody wanted to study what happened next because the early signals were bad. The early signals were bad. That's the sentence that should have stopped this entire industry in its tracks. Instead, terminated pharmaceutical research became a retail product marketed to young men who have no idea what they're ingesting. ACT3. The mechanism. Let me explain why RAD-140 damages brain tissue at a biological level, because understanding the mechanism makes clear that this isn't a bug, it's an inherent feature of how the compound works. Your brain is loaded with androgen receptors. This isn't controversial. It's basic neuroscience. Androgen receptors exist throughout the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and multiple other brain regions involved in memory, decision-making, and emotional regulation. These receptors evolved to respond to natural testosterone and DHT. In healthy physiological ranges, androgens actually support brain function. They enhance spatial memory. They contribute to neuronal maintenance. They play a role in neuroprotection. But here's the critical piece. Your brain's response to androgens depends on dose, duration, and receptor specificity. Natural testosterone binds to androgen receptors with a certain affinity. Let's call it baseline affinity. It also gets converted to estradiol, which activates entirely different receptor systems that provide neuroprotective effects. Your brain evolved with this balance. RAD-140 was specifically designed to bind androgen receptors with higher affinity than natural testosterone. That's literally the point. It's a selective agonist that activates muscle and bone receptors more powerfully than your own hormones would. But selectivity doesn't mean exclusivity. It means preference. RAD-140 still binds to androgen receptors in neural tissue. And when it does, it binds harder than testosterone would. At the same time, because it's not being aromatized into estradiol, you lose the estrogenic neuroprotective signaling that normally balances androgenic activity in the brain. This creates a one-two punch of neurological stress. First, excessive androgen receptor activation in neural tissue. Research on anabolic steroids has already established that supraphysiological androgen signaling can induce oxidative stress in neurons, disrupt mitochondrial function, and trigger inflammatory cascades. There's no reason RAD-140 would be exempt from these mechanisms, and in fact, its higher binding affinity might make it worse. Second, loss of neuroprotective estrogen signaling. When you suppress natural testosterone production, which RAD-140 absolutely does, and don't replace the estrogenic metabolites, you're removing a key factor that protects neurons from damage. This is why some steroid users experience cognitive issues despite testosterone's direct brain benefits. The balance gets disrupted. But there's a third mechanism that's specific to SARMs, and this one is rarely discussed. RAD-140 and similar compounds may interact with nuclear receptor co-regulators in ways that don't map onto natural hormone signaling. Your androgen receptors don't work in isolation. They recruit dozens of coactivator and corepressor proteins that determine what genes get expressed when the receptor is activated. Different tissues have different co-regulator profiles. In muscle tissue, RAD-140's co-regulator recruitment appears to favor anabolic gene expression. Great for hypertrophy. In neural tissue, we don't fully understand the co-regulator dynamics. Early research suggests that SARM compounds might activate transcriptional programs in the brain that natural testosterone wouldn't, essentially turning on genes that shouldn't be active in neurons. This could explain the white matter abnormalities. If RAD-140 is triggering aberrant gene expression in oligodendrocytes or astrocytes, you'd see exactly the kind of inflammatory and structural changes that appeared in trial imaging. The compound doesn't just bind harder. It might be doing different things at the genetic level depending on tissue type. And nobody, absolutely nobody, has characterized what those different things are in human brain tissue at the doses recreational users take. You're not just taking an untested drug. You're running an uncontrolled experiment on your own neural transcriptome. ACT4, real-world application. So what do you actually do with this information? Let's get practical. If you're currently taking RAD-140, I'm not going to tell you to flush it down the toilet today, although that's probably the right move. What I am going to tell you is this. You need to understand your actual risk profile, and you need to monitor for warning signs. First, recognize that dose matters exponentially. The concerning findings in clinical data occurred at 4 to 8 milligrams daily. If you're taking 20 or 30 milligrams, you're not in uncharted territory. You're in territory that no pharmaceutical researcher would ever approve for human exposure. You are running doses that make clinical toxicologists nervous. Second, duration compounds risk. The subjects who showed imaging abnormalities were in a trial lasting weeks. Forum protocols run 8, 12, 16 weeks. Some people cycle on and off repeatedly for years. Every additional week of exposure is additional time for cumulative damage that may not be reversible. Third, pay attention to neurological symptoms and don't dismiss them. Headaches during a RAD-140 cycle aren't just side effects. They might be signals of neuroinflammation. Brain fog isn't normal. Mood changes, sleep disruption, word-finding difficulty. These symptoms should concern you. They may indicate that your central nervous system is being affected. Here's what I'd actually recommend. If you haven't started, don't. The risk-to-reward ratio is insane when you understand the potential downside. Natural muscle building takes longer, but you keep your brain intact. If you're currently on cycle, consider stopping early. Talk to a physician if you can find one who won't judge you. Get baseline cognitive testing if possible. Monitor yourself for symptoms and take them seriously. If you've used in the past, don't panic, but do pay attention to your cognitive function over time. Consider getting a comprehensive neurological workup if you can afford it. And absolutely do not use again. If you're committed to enhancement, there are better characterized options. Testosterone itself, with appropriate monitoring, has decades of safety data. I'm not pro-steroids, but I'm anti-experimenting on your own brain with compounds that caused pharmaceutical companies to run for the exits. The fitness industry wants you to believe that RAD-140 is low risk because it's not as harsh as traditional steroids. That framing is completely backward. Traditional steroids are harsh because we know how they're harsh. We've studied them for 70 years. We understand their risk profile. RAD-140 isn't milder. It's unknown, and the early data that is available suggests it might be doing something to your brain that no amount of muscle is worth. You want to be jacked. I get it, but you want to be jacked and cognitively intact for the next 60 years of your life. You want to remember your kids' names. You want to maintain executive function as you age. You want to keep your personality. Nothing in any gym is worth trading that away. ACT 5. The bigger picture. Let's zoom out and ask the question that actually matters. Why does this information get buried while the myth stays visible? Follow the incentives. Pharmaceutical companies had no reason to publicize negative trial data for a program they'd abandoned. No upside. Publishing problematic results could create liability exposure and generate bad press. Better to quietly terminate and move resources elsewhere. The subjects signed waivers. The data went into a filing cabinet. The research chemical industry had every reason to keep selling. RAD-140 is one of the most popular SARMs on the market. It moves serious volume. The companies selling it have no obligation to prove safety. They're not technically selling it for human consumption. The warning labels say, for research purposes only, while the marketing materials show before and after physique photos. Fitness influencers had career incentives to promote it. Enhancement content gets views. Cycles get engagement. Nobody builds a YouTube following by saying, hey, maybe don't take the thing that causes brain lesions. That's not a sexy video. That doesn't sell. And you, the potential user, had psychological incentives to believe the myth. If RAD-140 is safe, you can take the shortcut. You can get the results faster. You don't have to confront the uncomfortable reality that real transformation requires time, consistency, and natural limitation acceptance. Every single actor in this system benefited from the dangerous information staying invisible. This is how it works. Not through conspiracy. Not through coordinated suppression. Just through aligned incentives that all point toward silence. And who pays the price? The 22-year-old who trusted forum consensus. The 17-year-old who found a research chemical website. The 35-year-old who wanted an edge without learning what edge meant for his neurological future. They pay the price. In brain lesions. In cognitive decline. In damage they won't understand for years, when it's far too late to undo. You now know what they weren't supposed to tell you. What you do with that knowledge is on you. The science is out there. They just don't want you finding it. That's why we're here. This is the Real Bio Protocol.